And I call the member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Last week I had the privilege to participate in the Howard Government Perspective or Retrospective, which is the first of a series of retrospectives looking back on the Howard Government. The first one, of course, concentrating on 1996, marking the 20th anniversary of the election of that government, and others will follow over the coming years. And can I at the outset commend Professor Tom Frame and Andrew Blythe at the Australian Centre for the Study of Armed Conflict and Society, and Nick Cater at the Menzies Research Centre for sponsoring these conferences. It was a well-attended event at the Australian Defence Force Academy. It included many presentations involving former colleagues David Kemp, Andrew Robb, John Anderson, Brendan Nelson, Gary Nann and Joe Gash, and also Margaret Reid, along with the leading journalist and modern historian of the Australian polity, Paul Kelly, and myself, and it involved some concluding reflections by former Prime Minister Howard himself. Three issues dominated the parliamentary agenda in 1996, namely budget repair, industrial relations reforms and the partial sale of Telstra. Indeed, the budgetary situation that faced the new government that it inherited on coming to office in 1996 was much worse than had been anticipated or expected. And the initial departmental advice to the government urged labour market, shipping and waterfront reform, along with the sale of Telstra. And indeed, these issues became the focal point of the then new government's program. As Paul Kelly observed in his book, The March of Patriots, the 1996 budget, and I quote, launched the political strategy that defined Howard's social vision and kept him in office. What I concentrated on my presentation, Mr Deputy Speaker, was what I might regard as the characteristics of leadership. And I noted that temperament is a critical element in good leadership. It was clear from the outset that Prime Minister Howard, along with various deputy leaders over that period of time from your party, sir, the National Party, that Prime Minister Howard presided over a very effective cabinet. He built a spirit of collegiality both in the cabinet and in the party room by balancing the ability to provide direction but at the same time to carefully listen to his colleagues. Indeed, Mr Howard's colleagues, from senior cabinet ministers to new backbenchers, were his political antennae, and that was very important to the longevity of that government. He may not have agreed, and my friend, the member for Lincoln, verifies this, and he and I were in that party room for many years, and indeed that was the case. He may not have agreed with every contribution that was made in the party room. There were some that were much better than others, as my friend will recollect, but he was always listening, observing trends and mindful that often it's the small things that can derail a government. Successful governments need longevity, but longevity will only happen if leaders are attuned to the winds of public concerns. And it was through that party room and that keen antennae that Prime Minister Howard was mindful of what were the public concerns of the time. I was the rapporteur of the party room for about 10 years, and my notes of party room meetings are replete with two expressions. The first was that the Liberal Party represented a broad church, embracing both classic liberalism and conservatism. The Prime Minister's ability to balance the tensions along this political spectrum were a major factor in the government's success. He understood, for example, that liberal economic reform or an expanded immigration program could only be successful if the government acknowledged and appreciated the innate conservatism of the Australian people. The second constant was John Howard's regular warning against hubris. I suspect it was a reminder to him as much as a reminder to all his colleagues, but he was correct. When leaders and governments appear arrogant, deaf to community concerns and out of touch, the electorate will respond negatively. A critical element of listening involved a direct conversation with the Australian people, often via talkback radio. In a recent lecture on public leadership, I observed the following. In my participation in public life for more than a quarter of a century, and my close observation of political leaders, including 7 Prime Ministers, I've concluded that it's not the grand rhetorical gestures, the proclamation of aspirations, or even the implementation of proposals or policies that mark the true measure of a leader, but the response to the unexpected, the unwanted and the unanticipated events that arise. In other words, it's the management of crises, not the projection of aspirations, which is the true mark of leadership, to finish my quote from my earlier observations. Nothing illustrated this point, Mr Deputy Speaker, in 1996 more than the Port Arthur massacre, which elicited an immediate and strong response. While endeavouring to accommodate the need, for example, of farmers to have guns, and I came from a rural farming background myself, the Prime Minister held his nerve on the central issue. There was a clear direction about the government's objectives. The Prime Minister and the party knew that advancing legislation, even in the face of an intransigent Senate, underscores the importance attached to the measures and the willingness of the government to fight for them. This was to become more apparent in subsequent years on issues such as industrial relations reform. I recall, for example, that the unfair dismissals proposals which the Howard Government put forward were rejected on more than 40 occasions by the Senate. Nonetheless, the government, not just over a number of years but indeed over a number of terms of Parliament, continued to maintain the principle that these reforms were necessary for flexibility, productivity and therefore job growth and rising standards of living within the Australian economy, and despite rejections time and time again, continued to advocate those reforms. In the end, the reforms were adopted after a couple of parliamentary terms, but it was important that that indeed had occurred. This is not to say that there were not mistakes during the first year of the government. The ministerial code, as all will acknowledge now, was too narrowly drawn. The image of a Prime Minister wearing a bulletproof vest at a rally in Sale, where I went to secondary school, was regrettable. And although Prime Minister Howard may disagree, I wonder whether the turnover of departmental secretaries in that first year was premature, at least in some cases, and contributed to the spate of budget leaks prior to the first Costello budget in August of 1996. And of course, the division of core and non-core promises created a weapon with which that government was attacked for many years by the opposition. 1996 was actually a very busy year in the Parliament. The government introduced 201 bills, 156 in this House, the House of Representatives, and 45 in the Senate. Of them, 84 passed in 1996, 77 the following year, and 3 in 1998. And for me, 2 areas were of personal interest. That was the family tax measures, which were introduced in 1996, and also the new schools legislation, which was actually an abolition of Labor's effectively no new schools policy, which precluded non-government schools being set up in regional areas such as your own, Mr Deputy Speaker, and in the outer suburbs of the major cities of Australia. So it was an important year, as Paul Kelly observed. It was the year that set up the government. It established the basis of that government, both in terms of its economic management and in terms of its social vision for the rest of what was a long term. And as I said at the end of my contributions, it's the character of leadership which is so important. In her portrait of the great American president Abraham Lincoln, the author Doris Kearns Goodwin described how Lincoln led an ambitious team of rivals, as she described it, who worked together for the common good of the United States. Given the events since the Howard era, a better understanding of the leadership traits of one of our most successful Prime Ministers is obviously worthy of ongoing study, and that will be something which the Centre and the Menzies Research Centre will carry out over the coming years. Finally, may I say, it was great to be there for the handover of 2 important historical items of furniture, the Menzies desk, which Prime Minister Howard used during his term in government, and the Chesterfield suite, which attracted from time to time some adverse comment and media attention. I was particularly interested in that because in 2008 I became the custodian of Prime Minister Howard's Chesterfield suite, and in fact I had it for almost as long as he did, and I was glad to be able to find a permanent home in the Menzies Library at ADFA for years to come into the future.
I thank the member.